Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome a very, very senior and accomplished professional from the UK, Mr. David Price. David, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
David is the lead for culture at the Power of Us agency. He's an international advisor to the New York-based cultural consultancy, Sparks and Honey. In 2009, David was awarded with the OBE, which is the Order of the British Empire, for services to education by Her Majesty the Queen. His first book was Open, How We'll Work, Live and Learn in the Future. And the next book is The Power of Us. And all of you know, I'm very, very partial to authors. So we will spend a little time talking about David's books. So, David, before we talk culture, tell me a little bit about your own journey.
Oh, goodness. It's not a plan that I would recommend to anyone. I began my working life, I was very young because I hated school, which is ironic since I then went on to spend a lot of time in education. But I left school at 16 and I got a job as a civil servant. I was probably the worst civil servant in the history of the civil service. And I just stood up one day at the age of 17 and announced that I was going to do what I really wanted to do, which was to be a musician. And the guy who was running the office said, "But what about your pension?" I thought this was hilarious. I said, "I'm 17." Now, of course, I think, oh, yeah, what about the pension? But I did. I realized in hindsight that I had a quite an entrepreneurial streak. And even though I had no plan as to how to become a professional musician, within 3 months, that's what I'd done. And I did that for 15 years. And then I suppose I thought this isn't really a job for a grown-up. And I decided to go to college, which was, I was quite a mature student at that point. But even then, I had no idea what I was going to do. And I sort of fell into working with community groups and adult education. And then eventually started doing more formal education at what Americans would call community colleges. We call them further education colleges. And then finally found the job I'd been looking for all my life, which was to start up a new college, which was a performing arts college with Sir Paul McCartney and Sir Ken Robinson. So two people who I'd admired tremendously. And I actually had known Ken a little bit before then. But more than anything, I wanted that clean sheet of paper. I wanted to start something from scratch because I could see what was wrong with education, but I wanted to have the chance to do it without all of the baggage that usually comes with bringing change to what is a very, very conservative occupation. And so I did that, and then did that for 10 years. And then I kind of went back to my roots, really. I decided that I would become a freelance consultant. And it was almost back to the days of being a working musician, you know. But I didn't put the guitar in the back of the car. I put the laptop in, but it was about traveling around, and then that became broader. And then eventually, I was working with Sir Ken, and he said, "It's about time you wrote a book." And I said, "Oh no, I couldn't write a book. I wouldn't know where to start." And he said, "You start at the beginning. Just start." And he sort of mentored me through the book Open, and it did very well. And then I started thinking about what was next. And I found myself with a foot in both worlds, in the corporate world and also in education, because for me, it was all about learning. And if organizations could get that right, then most of the other things naturally followed. So I was determined not to write two books, as it were. I wanted to combine them into a single audience. And people said, "You're crazy, you know, corporate world doesn't want to hear about some school, you know, the other side of the world." But that wasn't the case. And in Power of Us, it was even more so. And of course, it had the added layer of complexity that I finished The Power of Us, which is really, hopefully we'll talk about it more in a moment, but I finished it in February of 2020. And of course, we all know what happened in March of 2020.
Correct.
So it was a chance to test out some of these theories that I'd developed through looking at some of the world's most innovative organizations, corporate world, in the NGO world, and in the voluntary sector as well. And that although it meant that I had to go without sleep for 3 weeks while I rewrote the book, I'm very glad that I did. And so the book's been out now for a couple of years, but strangely, it feels like it's just come out because,
Amazing.
the world's only just started to open up again.
Yeah, very interesting. So let's talk about your books first then. Your first book, Open, it talks about the importance of innovation and creativity in the workplace. Can you share some examples of companies that have successfully implemented an open culture?
Yes, I mean, one of the striking examples for me was Procter & Gamble, who, everyone associates Procter & Gamble as being this highly successful multinational global corporate, but it's less well known that they came very close to extinction, and they decided that they weren't able to keep up with the pace of innovation. And so they set up, you may have come across it, they set up an initiative called Connect and Develop. And at its time, which was about 10, 15 years ago, it was considered very radical. It was one of the first examples of open innovation. The idea was so simple, but so effective, which was they just put the call out, and they created a website and said to people, if you've got an idea for a new product, or you can help us with technical problems that we're having, please get in touch and we'll come to some sort of financial arrangement if it succeeds. And it transformed the fortunes of the company, so much so that still to this day, about half of all revenues for Procter & Gamble come from outside of the company. And this is a company with an R&D department of 9,000 people. It's huge. And yet they still weren't able to keep up with the pace of innovation. And so they changed their company motto to proudly found elsewhere, which I think is fantastic. And yeah, the rest is history, as they say. They've done really well by looking beyond the organization. And I cite them as an example of good practice. It's not perfect, but it is an example of now how, I guess, and COVID really brought this to the fore. We have to break down some of these silos. We have to look beyond our own sphere of interest and activity. And if we can summon up the courage to do that, then there are the most amazing partnerships which became possible during COVID, and I hope will continue beyond that.
Amazing. Procter & Gamble is an amazing company, and since you spoke so highly about them, I must mention that both my sons and their spouses, 3 of the 4 work for Procter & Gamble in different parts.
Oh, wow.
Small world indeed. But David, you also, in your second book, The Power of Us, you discuss the impact of collaboration and teamwork in achieving success. Can you share with me, for my viewers and listeners, some tips on how to build effective teams?
Yes, I mean, it's such a difficult thing to summarize in just a soundbite, as it were, because of all the definitions of collaboration, my favorite one comes from, I think it was an American general whose name's escaped me for now, but he described it as collaboration is an unnatural act between non-consenting adults. And everyone knows it's the right thing to do, but people find it very difficult to do. And what I found in studying the companies that I looked at was, if you create the right culture, then that makes collaboration easier. And by the right culture, I mean a place where people are not afraid of making mistakes, where there is a strong learning environment, where I guess the silos that frequently divide us or broken down. You know, one of the most interesting entrepreneurs of the last couple of 100 years was Thomas Edison.
Correct.
And when he created the inventions factory in Menlo Park, you know, he had accountants working alongside chemists who worked alongside electricians, who worked alongside engineers, and they all took part in those kinds of discussions. So he kind of stimulated that natural curiosity. And it was really, I think, in the years beyond that, particularly in the mid 20th century, when we started, you know, Cubeland, and we started sectioning off specific areas of responsibility, and the Taylorist approach of dividing an organization up into very clear, specific activities. That's when we started to lose that spark of creativity that collaboration at its best can generate. But of course, it's not to say that it's easy. You know, collaboration depends on human beings, and as we know, they're extremely complex individuals. But I just feel going forward, especially in a world of AI, we have no choice. We have no choice but to develop a collaborative culture within our organizations.
Well said. You also talk of collective intelligence, and I wanted to ask you, how do you define collective intelligence, and why do you think it's important for individuals and organizations to embrace it?
Yes, well, it comes under quite a lot of different labels. Clay Shirky described it as the cognitive surplus, which is to say, you know, we all have interests beyond our immediate job, beyond the thing that we get paid for. And this is true now more so than ever. You know, typically it's characterized in the UK as the guy who goes down to the bottom of his garden and opens his shed and then tinkers away at something. But putting that cognitive surplus, and you know, we call it a surplus because it's not in need or used within the workplace. So being able to tap into that cognitive surplus, you know, whether it's inside the workforce or outside it, as Procter and Gamble showed, is what can open up new avenues, new ways of thinking. And so I think the kind of collective intelligence is the thing that's going to drive us. I speak in the book about the way in which we've moved from sharing what we knew, which is essentially what the first book was about, to sharing what we owned, which is the circular economy, to now sharing what we can make. And at the time when I finished the book, I just speculated that maybe there is another. I looked at the cooperative movement and the way in that's, you know, less so in my country, but more so around the world, but the way in which that has grown significantly, and suggested that it might be possible for people on their own volition to share what they make at scale, because it used to be that the thing that stopped you from doing that, there were two things that stopped you. One was access to the means of production. Well, now we've got 3D printers, which cost a couple of $100. The other was access to capital. And now we've got peer-to-peer lending services. So if you need money, it's more available now than it used to be. And so I speculated that, but when COVID came along, then it sort of proved it beyond anything that I could have imagined, because here we had things like the Mercedes Formula One design team working with the University College London Hospital to create the world's first continuous breathing machine of its type in 100 hours. I mean, remarkable production timescales.
Correct.
We had all sorts of alliances. You know, we had in this country, we had 1,000 face group what they called scrub hubs, which were just people who, largely women, who knew how to sew. And when we couldn't get our hands on any PPE, or worse, our government was buying PPE, which was already out of date, then these women were able to make it and organize at a huge scale and fill the gap that government had led, which is why one of the phrases I use in the book now is communities are outperforming bureaucracies, because I think that collective intelligence which exists in communities tends to be highly agile and adaptable. It's in it really often for a sense of fun, you know, if you think about hackathons and those sort of embodiments of it. Whereas bureaucracies often are there to slow the process down, to jam up the works. And during COVID, they were found to be wanting, you know, and I think a number of countries, not least mine, were found to not be able to respond quickly enough to the pandemic. And so I think, in a way, if we learn from those experiences, and that's the big if.
Correct.
But if we can learn from those experiences, how can we tap into that strong sense of ethical well-being which existed, particularly at the start of the pandemic? And how can we recognize that, you know, these networks exist and they are learning from one another all of the time? I mean, the first book I talked about the Occupy movement, because I think social movements are fascinating examples of this. And I talked about Occupy as a case in point where they generated a huge amount of interest, but when they were asked what would success look like, they couldn't answer it. And other groups now have since learned from that. So Extinction Rebellion have learned from Occupy. I think Black Lives Matter have learned from previous attempts at civil rights. And so what we're seeing, largely because of technology, is that this cognitive surplus, this collective intelligence, now has somewhere to go. And it's never been easier to find your tribe, you know, to find the people who are interested in the same thing that you are. And that's what we're seeing. And I think the challenge now is, do those bureaucracies, and I include corporations in that category, do they want to try and stop these groups, or do they want to work with them? Because I frankly, I don't think you can stop them. And I cite all sorts of examples in one of the chapters in the book of biohackers and people who are basically faced with dreadful life chances. And when you're in that situation, when you've maybe only got months or at the most a couple of years to live, you'll try anything. And you will look for solutions anyway. And so there's a huge amount of ingenuity within those groups. And you can't tell them, stop doing that. Their life depends upon it. So I think we have to find ways within bureaucracies, within governments, to stimulate that, you know, and I think India has been particularly good in its open innovation to drug research, because, you know, the typical approach hitherto has been new drugs or recycled drugs get repurposed, and some pharmaceutical tries to close them down.
Correct.
And I understand why that is, and I understand the need for regulation. But nevertheless, it's better to work with these people than to try to regulate them out of existence.
Well said. You also talk about collaboration, which is a key theme in your book. What are some of the strategic advantages of collaborating, and how can this be done in teams or organizations?
Yeah, this is one of the knowing doing gaps that I frequently point to, and certainly I see it in my world of education, where, you know, there isn't a more isolated activity, bizarrely, than education currently, because everyone knows there's 40 years of evidence to show that collaboration improves productivity, it leads to greater innovation, all of those things. And yet, what do? We put teachers in a room by themselves. We give children work to do by themselves. And then we expect them suddenly to be prepared for the world beyond that, which expects them to work in teams. So I think we have to look at, how do we create the necessary set of circumstances? What are the building blocks? And in the book, I cite a number of things like protocols, so that you have a number of ways of conducting meetings or, you know, brainstorming sessions, which no one will get defensive about, because I've seen that happen. I've seen that happen really badly. Or rituals that, you know, build up over time over a company. I know one organization that's got a thing called Jeff's Law, which is that one of the employees, used to say, you know, you can't go ahead with an idea until I've had a look at it. And his name was Jeff, and that became a kind of ritual for that organization. It didn't really mean that, but it just meant that before we go ahead with this, let's just run it by a few people and let's just make sure we're heading down the right path. So I think how we create the sort of apparatus of collaboration is a fascinating thing. I think some places do well, particularly if it's got a model of servant leadership. Because one of the things about servant leadership is that, unlike the kind of ego-driven leadership, where, let's face it, maybe 30 years ago, if you were the CEO of a company, the chances were that you would probably sat in the seat of most of the people that you were taking advice from. So you thought that you knew how to do their job anyway.
Yeah,
that's impossible now. The organizations are so complex now. You can't do that. So you need to have that humility that goes with that. And if you're the kind of leader, and one of the leaders I cite in the book is a fantastic example, was Gary Ridge from WD-40. But he was the kind of person who would say, I'm not the smartest person in the room. I need to fill the room with people who are smarter than me.
Correct.
And I need to be humble enough to be able to take their advice. And I think if we can do that with the models of leadership, if we can distribute the decision making that goes with that, you know, so we're seeing flatter organizations, but are we seeing decisions being distributed down within the organization as well? So I think I call that the operating system of organizations, and I think that's what leaders now have to think very carefully about.
Well said. You know, we're running out of time, so I only have time for one more question.
Oh, wow, it went so quick.
I don't know whether we'll have time for culture, but maybe I'll seek some other time from you on culture some other time. But, you know, David, you've also written extensively about the need for individuals to be lifelong learners. How can we encourage a culture of lifelong learning in our institutions and in our society?
Yeah, it's a great question. And frankly, since, you know, what we've seen, what the world has seen now since November 22 and the arrival of ChatGPT is that this AI revolution isn't something that's going to be coming along in the future. It's here now.
Absolutely.
And I think it has made everyone think about how they need to retrain, how they need to refocus. And if ever we needed a great example of the kind of things that people like me and others have been saying, which is you will have many, many different roles in your career. Correct. So your learning never stops. If you want to stay ahead of the game, you need to be constantly learning. And of course, organizations need to create the right kind of culture, the right kind of apparatus whereby you can learn. And frankly, what I think we've seen now, particularly with AI, is that doesn't always mean sitting in a training room. You know, that's a pretty inefficient way of learning. And yet so many corporations are still wedded to that idea, even though it's been proven not to be as effective as informal, on-demand learning. So I think one of the lessons we'll get from AI is that we will genuinely get personalized learning to suit the individual's needs. What we need to do, it seems to me, is to create the culture whereby that is part of your work. It's not seen as something that you do when you go home.
Correct.
It's part of your work. The learning is the work.
Very well said. So I think I'm going to try and squeeze in one more question, because there's so much you've written in these two amazing books. And this would be my last question. How do you balance the need for innovation and risk-taking with the need for stability and security in an organization?
Yeah. Wow. So many people get that wrong. And, you know, I certainly don't have all the answers within that. But I think what we need is what I call a disciplined approach to innovation. I meet so many people who are leaders of organizations, and they want to throw everything up in the air. They've got so many great ideas. Frankly, I used to be one of those leaders. And it doesn't work anyway long term, because eventually people stop having ideas of their own because they know this guy's going to come in and tell us what we're doing. But I also think that what happens when you put too much onto your staff too quickly is that they're going to fall over at some point. And I have seen votes of no confidence in leaders, not because they didn't like them. They actually did like them as individuals, but simply because they were trying to do too much too quickly. And the people who are trying to measure whether innovation has worked couldn't put any specific innovation down to, was it that factor that led to the change? Was it that caused things to go horribly wrong? We have no idea, because we're just doing far too many things at once. So having a more disciplined approach to innovation, and I understand, again, with the development of AI now, we are seeing things being rushed out to market that aren't ready to go to market.
Correct.
And that is a big mistake. But I understand the pressures of all that. And Google, I think Google wanted to take a bit more time before they got their own.
Absolutely, it'll barred out. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And but I think they were sort of forced into it. But nevertheless, it does seem to me that the smart people in the room are going to wait until they get a degree of confidence that innovation is both needed and has a chance of working, or else you can just waste a tremendous amount of money.
Well said.
So yes, I understand it looks great on the TV, to get the Elon Musk type character who seems to be betting the farm on whatever the latest idea is. But, I think things are kind of proving quite difficult for Mr. Musk right now.
Absolutely.
Because he tried to do too much too quickly.
Absolutely. Well said. And on that note, David, as I said, I could have just carried on talking to you, but I've run out of time. Thank you so much for the incredible discussion about both your books. I am going to ask all our viewers and listeners to go and check out the books. Open How We'll Work, Live and Learn in the Future, and the second one, The Power of Us, on Amazon. I'm going to check them out myself. Thank you, David, for speaking to me about your books. Thank you for talking to me about collective intelligence, about so many different aspects of collaboration, about managing conflict, and about being lifelong learners. Thank you again for speaking to me, and good luck.
You're more than welcome.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website, www.tbcy.in, to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for The Brand Called You.